In recent times, a way a studio can make a huge profit is by making a shared universe. As we've seen, it's been done with the MCU, the DCEU, and one of the most unique ones is this horror cinematic universe, the Conjuring universe. We've recently released a new movie to its collection, third in the main Conjuring titles, but something like the 8th in the universe with all its spin-offs. But that is The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. These mainline Conjuring movies are all loosely based off true events. As of filming, this movie is actually not out in the US, but here it is out in cinemas and I was lucky enough to see it yesterday. So without further ado, let's get into my updated ranking featuring Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. Coming in at 8th and last place, I have The Curse of La Lorona. This one just doesn't feel like it belongs in this universe. And to be fair, the only real connection it has is a character from the Annabelle movie from 2014. Other than that, there's no real signs that it is connected, but it is, and it's a very forgettable movie. I was familiar with the story of La Llorona. I've seen it in TV show before called Grimm, and when I saw that they were making it into a movie, I was a bit unsure about how it would do, and it's safe to say that it didn't blow me away, because this is, as I said, a very straightforward, familiar horror movie. These Conjuring movies, they have had their creative plot details or scares. Here, just everything feels so familiar. It relies heavily on jump scares, which aren't scares. They're not a person actually being scared, it's the human reaction to, you know, a loud change in volume. Other than some good performances from some good actors, there's not really much going in favour of this movie. Coming in at 7th place is Annabelle. This was the first of the spin-off movies, and actually the second movie to come in this shared universe. And with spin-offs, you tend to take a character, or in this case an object, from the mainstream movies, and then you're trying to tell an interesting story about it. And it does do this without the word interesting. Annabelle was this creepy presence in the Conjuring movie, which had this sense of mystery around it. For a kid's toy, people were oddly scared of it, so it had this real sense of what happened with this doll, and finding out it doesn't actually really show us much, doesn't tell an interesting story. Once again, it relies on big jump scares and dramatic changes in music and sound, which became really tedious. And on top of that, it's just boring. I mentioned everyone was interested to find out what this Annabelle doll was like or what it had done, and the story told was just boring. It mainly focuses on this woman who's pregnant or has a child just being tormented around the house, and it's very, very repetitive. Nothing unique about it. The characters fail to stand out. Like, I can't recall any interesting things they have done, and it's safe to say it was just a big disappointment, especially after what was established with Annabelle in the Conjuring movie. Coming in at 6th place is The Nun. Yet another spin-off. And to be fair, even though it is underwhelming, I think it does get more hate than it deserves. The change of environment and location and, frankly, time period made for a unique viewing, especially within this universe. And that location does lend itself to some creepy visuals and scenes. However, after such a creepy character, the nun, Valak, was established, it was quite an underwhelming follow-up to see this big demonic entity, and I feel it doesn't quite capture its potential that was teased in that movie. There were small things I could look past, as it's a horror movie and not all things tend to make sense, but towards the second half of the movie, the plot just gets laughably bad when they start to include the blood of Jesus Christ, and I was genuinely there in theatres with my friends in shock at how bad things took a turn towards. It takes its time establishing things, but once you get into the main flow of things, with these characters, it feels like you're in a continuous cycle of scares and character decisions, and it leads to a disappointing movie, but one I think gets more hate than it deserves. Coming in 5th place is Annabelle Comes Home. Gary Dalboon's first directed movie is nonetheless solid and contains some suspenseful moments filled with scares you weren't expecting. The concept of Annabelle getting free and possessing all the artifacts is actually quite interesting, maybe a bit silly if you think about it properly, but it made for a fun horror movie watch. There were some very cool visuals with the rotating light in Judy's room which changes colour. It led for some creepy moments, as well as the sequences with the bride's dress. Where I think it got a bit silly at times was where they started to bring in things like Hellhound, where it just felt a bit out of place, and if they wanted to have any real impact with that character, they should maybe save it for its own movie, which I doubt will happen. The whole plotline with this love interest is extremely unnecessary. You would think he had something to the plot, but no, he's just there to, I guess, maybe comic relief. Another character would be tormented. And to be honest, since he lives across from the Warrens, I expected maybe a bit more from him, but nonetheless, far from the best in this universe, but seriously, nowhere near the worst. Coming in at 4th place is the main reason I'm doing this video, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. With these main 3 Conjuring movies, this was the first one to have a change of director, and it really does show. The pacing is good in this movie, there's not one dull moment, it's a constantly moving story which doesn't drag. Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga's chemistry is still here on screen as we actually get to see some different sides to their relationship, as well as us getting a new threat in this movie compared to any of the other ones where a character develops a health condition early on in the movie which restricts them from doing certain things and gives them something else to worry about. However, James Wan's uniqueness has completely vanished from this movie, and if it wasn't for the title and the characters in it, this would just be a horror movie which was forgotten about the day after watching. James Wan had a way of creating these unique jump scares where even though we could sense it was coming, he'd still find a way to surprise us with how it's delivered. Here it attempts that, but frankly, we're either expecting the way it turns out, or when it does surprise us, it's just not scary. In the first 2 Conjuring movies, I had this sense of vulnerability. Not here. It seriously lacked any feeling of tension. I do think that is partly due to the fact that Conjuring 1 and 2 took place in a house where the house was haunted, I guess you could say. Here, it happens all over the place and they're being followed by this entity. Doesn't really capture the same feeling of claustrophobia, I guess you could say. And there wasn't really any part where I was really scared. In fact, the scariest part, or the creepiest part of this movie, was when the credits rolled and they started to play real life audio from the case. The movie is loosely based off true events, and the case is a very interesting tale. However, I feel like from the first 2 Conjuring movies, where obviously Ed and Lorraine Warren are real people and these are adapted from their real life cases, I feel like here, because it's one of their more famous ones, they feel like they have to make it into a movie, but the concept just doesn't really make for as creepy of a movie as those other 2. However, I really don't regret seeing it, and I don't think it's a bad decision that they made it, because I really like Ed and Lorraine Warren in these movies, and I just like seeing all these movies that they are in. Also loses that intrigue when the demonic presence has originated from a curse that someone has planted on them, rather than that property being haunted or whatever. So when it's like a human character behind everything, it just doesn't have that same feeling. So I was very excited for this movie. I didn't expect it to be nearly as good as the first 2 Conjuring movies, as they have the director of the Curse of La Lorona here. I can't say I'm surprised, but to be honest, I was a bit disappointed with how Hollywood-esque it felt, rather than it trying to be something that stands out. Coming in at 3rd place is Annabelle Creation. Now on paper, following the disastrous Annabelle, which was a prequel to The Conjuring, a prequel to Annabelle sounded like a very bad idea, but it's actually the best out of those 3 Annabelle movies, and as you can see, the 3rd best movie in this universe. It does prove that these spin-offs can be good and not just an easy cash grab, and it adds in what was really lacking from that Annabelle movie: some really good jump scares and an interesting, mysterious plot. I guess another one you could chuck in there was some very fleshed out characters, because here you are rooting for them. They make them interesting enough that you want them to survive, you don't want them to be in danger, and that's frankly something you don't get too often in horror movies these days. I think also that attachment to those characters also led for those jump scares to be more effective, because at times they were really predictable or relying on jump scares too much, but because I think you're attached to these characters and you feel that intensity, that tension, you do care for them more often, and tying into this fleshed out, mysterious story throughout the movie, which averted all expectations and became one of the best in the franchise. Coming in at 2nd place is The Conjuring 2. Now, if you've been paying attention to the ratings in the bottom corner, you can see how much of a quality gap there is between this and Annabelle Creation, and even Annabelle Creation and The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. Right off the bat, we're introduced to the nun, who's this terrifying demonic presence who we talked about previously in this list. This is where she's established in this movie and has this continuous creepy presence. I remember watching it for the first time on Halloween with some of my friends, and everyone was scared of the nun. The overall premise is the same on paper as The Conjuring, if you think about it, you know, haunted house. But the change of location, the change of characters and environment makes this feel like a very fresh movie, especially in this franchise, even though on paper it is very similar to The Conjuring. Part of the reason it does feel fresh is because they start to tie in a really interesting story, which stood out for me, where the Warrens have to deal with the press, who are trying to expose them for thinking all their cases are a hoax, and that still remains a mystery to this day, whether it's true or not. Obviously, it's very hard to prove, but I found it a very interesting aspect to include within this movie, adding a different dynamic to the franchise. Ed and Lorraine Warren's relationship is furthermore carried on here, improving on certain aspects, and you can see their importance to each other. And this is just one of the rare occasions where you get a very, very solid sequel, especially for a modern horror movie. There are times where the family coming to terms with what is going on does feel a bit rushed, and when you get into the final act, where they've included so many different plots, it does feel a bit convoluted and a bit too much. But overall, this is a very good horror movie and a very good follow-up to our number one pick. That number one pick being The Conjuring, the one to kick off this franchise. Off the top of my head, this is one of my favourite horror movies of all time. Right off the bat, we get a very creepy tone established with the Annabelle doll. Even though it's not an important part of how this movie plays out, it does set that tone. This was one of the first horror movies I ever watched, and it never failed to get under my skin with how creepy it is. The score captures that tone in a fantastic way. I'm not someone who tends to get scared too much and isn't really disturbed that often, but this movie always makes me feel very vulnerable, as that tension is so high, and it can make it go from feeling like safe to terrified within a matter of seconds. I mentioned that tension, it's really unbearable because it gets so high at some points where you know a jump scare's coming, but you're just like, oh, it could come from any direction. And when it does come, it does not fail to deliver on its scares. It naturally sets up things like the kids playing a game, which then incorporates into some of the scares, which I thought was a very, very clever way. James Wan did a fantastic job of this one and its sequel. As I mentioned, the plot is very straightforward, loosely based off true events, but just the way it's executed is fantastic. Most horror movies have an R rating for blood, violence, gore, maybe even language. This one doesn't really have any of that. It warrants its R rating just off the scares enough, so that should say enough about it, because it was initially intended to be PG-13, but once people saw it, it got moved to the R rating. So as you can see by my rating and what I've just said about it, if you haven't seen it, just go check it out. That was my ranking of the 8 Conjuring universe movies. As always, let me know what your ranking is down below, and make sure to like this video if you want to see more of this sort of content. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope to see you in my next one.